Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's Capital Conversation. I probably don't need to introduce myself to many of you, but I'm Sue Polis, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations and Public Affairs for Lutheran Services in America. And a lot's happened since we last convened on this forum. We're delighted today to be joined by two great colleagues, Edwin Park, who will be familiar to many of you, who's been with us through this Medicaid budget reconciliation bill battle. So Edwin's back. We invited him back today to talk a little bit about some of the implications as this bill gets implemented. And then we're also lucky enough to be joined today by Ellen Riddleberger from McAllister and Quinn. And Ellen's really going to help us amidst a very dynamic, changing, shifting landscape, talk about, yes, some of the challenges, but also where some of the opportunities are related to federal and state funding, among other options. Ellen said she could talk for 3 hours about this. Of course, we don't have that much time, but wanted to at least provide some line of sight where there are some options emerging in the federal funding landscape. We want to make this interactive. This is for you to support your work. So please use the chat or the raise hand feature as we move along. So briefly, before I turn it over to Edwin, of course, this budget reconciliation bill is now moving to implementation. It's going to put a lot more pressure on state budgets. Some state budgets already under pressure. So wanted to give Edwin some time to talk about this today, as we are also anticipating two additional budget bills, perhaps one later this year and one early next year, where we do anticipate more efforts to make additional cuts to Medicaid. So at the end, we'll kind of come back and talk about some of the work that we're doing to gear up as we anticipate another budget fight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Edwin to lead us off and talk about, give us some thoughts about where we are with the passage of the budget bill. Please, Edwin.
Thanks, Sue. So I'll talk about the Medicaid and CHIP provisions in the budget reconciliation law, which the president signed on July 4th. There's many Medicaid and CHIP provisions. There's 23 separate provisions related to the Medicaid or the Children's Health Insurance Program. We still don't have final Congressional Budget Office estimates for the size of the cuts or the impact on health coverage. It's probably going to be somewhere, around $1 trillion in gross Medicaid and CHIP cuts, as many as 16, 17 million more uninsured by 2034. But we'll have to wait and see because there were a number of last-minute changes before the bill was enacted, passed by the Senate and then the House, due to issues with the so-called Byrd Rule, which was sort of violating some of the budget reconciliation rules. So some provisions dropped out, or some provisions required significant modification. But we'll have to wait and see, and we're hopeful that those Congressional Budget Office numbers will come out next week. And once they do come out, we're going to put out at Georgetown CCF a very detailed explainer on the Medicaid CHIP and marketplace provision. So I just want to talk about three buckets of cuts in the bill, and happy to answer questions about any aspect of the Medicaid and CHIP provisions in the law. But the first bucket is really about state financing. So there are a number of provisions that target the state's ability to use so-called provider taxes. So for those of you familiar, these are taxes and assessments on hospitals, nursing homes, and other providers to finance a portion of the state's cost of Medicaid. State general fund dollars, income taxes, sales taxes, in some cases property taxes, form the bulk of the state's share of Medicaid costs, but provider taxes are a large and growing revenue source for states. So there are some provisions that affect all states. There's some provisions that only affect certain states. including just expansion states, but I just wanted to mention them because they all will really hamstring states moving forward in terms of financing Medicaid and then eventually cut existing revenues that are used to finance the programs. Um, the first provision would, as of date of enactment, prevent states from imposing any new provider taxes or increasing any existing provider taxes. So, for example, if a state's facing a budget shortfall that arises, including one that's unexpected over the course of this current state fiscal year, they can't close that deficit with more revenues from those provider taxes. If a state wants to enact improvements to the Medicaid program, whether it's for the 10 remaining non-expansion states to take up the expansion, finance improvements to home-based services, mental health services, increased provider payments, those would all be barred in terms of relying on provider taxes to help finance that. So that's for all states. There's a second provision that also takes effect immediately on date of enactment, so July 4th, and that is certain states have provider taxes. They're mostly related to managed care organizations that is a technical term they call uniformity waiver taxes. There's at least 7 states that have such taxes, and they are immediately prohibited. This includes some states like California and New York, but also, states like Ohio and West Virginia. The Secretary of Health and Human Services can grant states with such prohibited taxes a transition period of up to 3 years, but there's no requirement that he provide any transition, and the transition could be considerably less than 3 years. So for those states, they're going to have to face an immediate budget shortfall that they will have to close potentially as soon as this year. And then the last set of provider taxes, which is really targeting the Medicaid expansion, is a restriction on existing provider taxes that states use, but only in expansion states. So there is a cap on the size of provider taxes, can't exceed 6% of net patient revenues for a particular type of provider, hospitals, ambulance providers, others. And in expansion states, that current 6% cap will be phased down starting in federal fiscal year 2028 by 0.5 percentage point a year. So starting October 1st, 2027, which is the start of the federal fiscal year, this cap will be reduced to 5.5% for all provider taxes except those related to nursing homes and those related to intermediate care facilities for those with intellectual disabilities. And then it'll phase down by 0.5 percentage point a year until you get to fiscal year 2032 when it'll reach 3.5%. And so for a lot of states that are expansion states, they have provider taxes that are above 3.5%. So by my count, based on KFF data, there's about 18 states that are expansion states that have hospital taxes above 3.5%. And there's a handful of those. I believe it's 7 or 8 that have taxes above 5.5%. So, yeah, 7 of those states, excuse me. So those states will have to start facing big budget shortfalls in fiscal year 2028. And notably, a number of states used increased hospital taxes in particular to finance the Medicaid expansion. In some cases, like in a state like Arizona, the legislation authorizing the Medicaid expansion was directly tied to an increase in the hospital tax in the state. And so, this would really have a big hit on state financing, not just for the Medicaid expansion itself, but throughout the Medicaid program. So even if you have a provider tax that's, unaffected, like related to nursing home provider rates could be cut, or eligibility for LTSS, long-term services and supports, could be cut because of this budget shortfall created by restriction on such provider taxes. And so, that's certainly, a big concern one of the biggest concerns from this legislation in terms of what it means for state budgets. So that's bucket one. Bucket two is that in addition to this restriction on provider taxes just in expansion states, related to the so-called safe harbor cap, the size of the taxes, there are a number of other provisions that are again targeted just at the Medicaid expansion population, those who are enrolled in the Medicaid expansion, targeted just at states with a Medicaid expansion. And they include, and of course, it received a lot of attention, a mandatory work reporting requirement for expansion adults. Again, it's just in expansion states, with the exception of also applying to Wisconsin, which has a partial Medicaid expansion but is not an expansion state. And um, starting January 1, 2027, states will have to institute a work reporting requirement for most expansion adults ages 19 through 64. There are mandatory exemptions for a number of different populations, but states can still require verification. They may not have to do an automatic exemption if it's not possible. And notably, the work requirements do apply to parents. So if you are a parent of a child age 14 and older, you're not exempt from these work reporting requirements. We don't have final coverage estimates from CBO, which have previously estimated the number of people who would lose Medicaid as a result of these work reporting requirements. But those earlier estimates were about 5 million fewer people enrolled. And it's always important to note that work reporting requirements, as the Congressional Budget Office, Harvard researchers, Urban Institute researchers have all found, they don't have a positive impact on employment or hours worked. They produce savings because people who are working and should satisfy the work requirements or should be exempt aren't able to navigate the complex systems and processes that are required in terms of reporting your hours or your work, or to show that you are exempt from these requirements. Especially if you are required to provide verification. So, that is going to have a significant effect on coverage. Some of the estimates were, 10.5 million fewer Medicaid enrollees under earlier versions of the bill. So this work reporting requirement constitutes about half of the enrollment loss in Medicaid. And a significant number of those who are disenrolled, end up uninsured under the work reporting requirement. A couple other things to mention that are specifically targeted towards the expansion group is mandatory renewals that are more frequent than the normal 12 months. So, we just went through unwinding of the continuous coverage protection. We know that a lot of people who are eligible fall off during renewal, even though, they remain eligible, but they couldn't, meet the timelines, produce required documentation. So right now, expansion individuals are renewed in terms of their coverage every 12 months. For all expansion individuals, starting uh, uh, starting in 2027. Um, uh, there will be now mandatory renewals every 6 months. So all states have to do it no matter what. And as a result, there's going to be a lot of people who are eligible for the expansion. Even if they're able to satisfy the work requirement, they're going to have to go through more frequent renewals and therefore at risk of being disenrolled at that point. There's also a provision requiring mandatory cost sharing for all expansion individuals for many services. That takes effect in 2028, October 1st, 2028. The cost sharing charges can be up, as high as $35. but states have to charge the services subject to the cost sharing, at least some amount, and it could be as high as $35 as long as total cost sharing burdens don't exceed 5% of income. And again, this is just for expansion individuals, not for those who are enrolled through other eligibility categories in Medicaid. So it gives you a sense of the expansion itself is being targeted. The last thing, last sort of bucket of cuts I'll mention is related to lawfully present immigrants. So, as Medicaid has never covered undocumented immigrants, but lawfully present immigrants are eligible for Medicaid. Under prior law, that includes refugees, asylees, those who are legal permanent residents after 5 years, and this law eliminates Medicaid and CHIP coverage for everyone, but four groups: um, refu those who are uh, admitted permanent legal permanent residency, those who are certain Cuban and Haitian admittees, and those who are uh, uh, migrants from the Pacific who are part of the Compact of Free Association Nations. So the other group is those that are voluntarily covered by states using the so-called IKEA option, which provides Medicaid and CHIP coverage to technically lawfully residing in that category, but it's the same effect. Children and pregnant women. About half the states use Medicaid and or CHIP to do that, and they would continue to be able to receive federal funding for that coverage. But many lawfully present immigrants who are now eligible for Medicaid, including eligible for Medicaid right away, no longer have it starting October 1st of next year, so October 1st, 2026. So that includes refugees and asylees. This is consistent with how there are provisions removing eligibility within Medicare for lawfully present immigrants, including refugees, asylees, parolees, and others, as well as in the marketplace, which has similar language, removing eligibility for premium tax credits to purchase marketplace coverage among these categories, with again the exceptions for those with um, uh, permanent residents, COFA migrants, and certain Cuban and Haitian admittees. So, there's certainly these provisions are explicit cuts to eligibility compared to prior law, targeting many of the most vulnerable legal immigrant categories, including refugees and asylees. So, there are many other Medicaid and CHIP provisions that I'm happy to talk about further, but it gives you a sense of sort of the sort of themes and tenets of the legislation, the likely impacts, which are going to be on state budgets through provider taxes, which will likely lead to deficits that require Medicaid cuts to help close those. Cuts specifically targeting the Medicaid expansion so that even if states are able to maintain the expansion, that those who continue to be eligible for the expansion are less likely to be able to enroll and stay enrolled in that coverage. And then finally, explicit cuts to eligibility targeting many lawfully present immigrants, though we don't have good data on the numbers who may be losing Medicaid coverage starting next year. So with that, I think I will stop, but happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for that great overview. Well, great might not be the right word, important overview. So there were a couple questions that came in through the chat, and we'll go there first. Meg Litz, do you wanna say your question? Do you want to come off the mute?
Sure. I know that in some states, in some areas, they've had reporting requirements, and my understanding is that the new requirements will be let on a lower frequency than they have been in other states where they've made those requirements, which we have obviously documented evidence of people falling off because of that requirement. And paperwork is a challenge for a lot of people. What is it that you think that we can do to be able to provide support for people who are going to need to go through that process on a maybe for some on a for the first time more frequent basis, and for just everybody in general, to make sure that that's not the obstacle or hurdle that gets in the way?
Are you talking about the work requirements or the renewals, more frequent renewals?
Both, actually.
Okay.
So the work requirements, that's the one that I know has been documented in other states where they've had much more
Mhm.
frequent requirements. This sounds like it's less than that, but we all know that any kind of paperwork can just be a barrier.
Yeah, so for those states that have already experimented with work requirements, or they may have an existing one like in Georgia, there may be requirements in this budget reconciliation law that conflict. And to the extent that it may conflict, the federal law will supersede that waiver or that approach. And so to the extent that those requirements may be stricter, they're going to have to fall into compliance. That being said, there is some flexibility for states to make these work reporting requirements somewhat less harsh. So for example, a state has to require people to satisfy the work requirement or qualify for an exemption for at least 1 month before they apply. But the law permits states to look back as much as 3 consecutive months. Obviously, that's going to be, even harsher, particularly if someone's losing a job and the processes, are very onerous. So to the extent that it's possible, if a state just does 1 month, obviously that's going to be less onerous. Similarly, when you're checking for satisfying a work requirement or whether someone is exempt, you have to at least check once between the now mandatory 6 month renewal periods. But there is the option for states to require, for example, every month that someone will require every month for verification that someone is complying with either the work requirement or has been enrolled in an exemption. So, that's an example where a state could be harsher, but if you do the bare minimum, then, it will be there'll be less of an adverse effect on enrollment than if a state maximize that. That being said, states can't get waivers to ease these requirements. There's specific language that says that states can't waive the provisions of the work reporting requirements. On the renewals, I think just like with unwinding of the continuous coverage requirement during the pandemic, to the extent that those renewals can be done in an ex parte basis, relying on different sources that are available to the state without requiring paperwork, without requiring a lot from the individual themselves, then they or their families will have an easier time getting their coverage renewed in the expansion under this more frequent renewal requirement.
So Edwin, just based on how you answered that question, it sounds like if our members are concerned about this, a lot of decisions get made at the state level about how these things get implemented. And so if you're not already, you want to be talking to folks in your states, whether it's your governor's office, your Medicaid office, your lawmakers, because these decisions do get now made state by state.
Yeah, and states are required to try to automate the exemptions, for example, as much as possible. And if that's the case, they're sort of trying to make an exemption for those who are medically frail automatic. They come up with good proxies that would be, a way to ensure that more people who should get that exemption do get it and are exempt from the work requirement, don't get disenrolled. The one sort of nuance here is that the secretary, so in this case, the CMS administrator, will be issuing an interim final rule. And that interim final rule will actually not be subject to notice and comment. And that will be, setting a lot of the standards for the work reporting requirements themselves, the exemptions, and the hope is that, it gives some flexibility to states rather than, being more strict. And in turn, that would limit the ability of states to try to think of mitigation strategies to make this, somewhat less harsh.
So Edwin, it's Tracy Sampson. You might want to speak up, or I can read your question.
Sure. Hi, Sue. Thank you. Thanks for setting this up. It's so helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is waking up in the morning saying, what can we do to mitigate this? And I think I just heard you say, Edwin, that there's possibilities depending on the state that the service agencies, you all, can have a more specific and proactive role potentially in handling some of this paperwork on behalf of enrollees for either re-enrollment or maybe even work requirements. Is that true?
I mean, and there's some, enrollment assistance, but that can always be provided. But I think it will, depend on, how much of this is automatic, how much of, verification is required on the part of individuals to show that, they're exempt. So, for example, parents with kids 13 and younger should be automatically exempted, and, are the systems going to be good enough to look, well, there's a household, there's a parent, on Medicaid, but there's also a child on Medicaid, and that child is clearly 11, so therefore we're automatically exempting that. That's going to be a big thing, is to ensure that these systems are working as intended, and trying to make it as, simple as possible for beneficiaries and their families. The problem, of course, as we saw with unwinding, is sometimes these systems don't work, and a lot needs to be done in a short period of time to revamp, adequate eligibility and enrollment systems. So, that this is going to be a big challenge, even if a state wants to do the right thing and try to reduce the magnitude of the enrollment losses that would occur.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about how the frontline processes might be enhanced proactively to deal with this, setting up a way to agree on work verification documentation with the client and then just making it part of the case management process, like that kind of stuff that's in control of the providers. So anyway, I've just been thinking a lot about that and was wondering if that was even possible, really.
Yeah, I don't think we know yet because we haven't seen what the administration is going to come out with. We don't know, what I don't work on SNAP, but SNAP already has some work requirements that are, made harsher under this legislation. To the extent that, some states are doing a better job in implementing work requirements in SNAP, that could be, a model to try to, limit the enrollment losses that are going to result from this requirement.
Thanks, Edwin. And there was another question from Rebecca Friedman. Rebecca, do you want to just talk about your question? You were asking me about cost sharing. She may have dropped off, but her question was, what will the impact of cost sharing be? What is the $35 increase from? That was during your remarks, Edwin.
Yeah, so right now, some services are entirely exempt from cost sharing: emergency services, pediatric services, those related to pregnancy-related care, family planning. This law says that for anyone who's an expansion individual, for those services that are currently exempt, they stay exempt. additional services like primary care, mental health, substance use disorder, and health center services are exempt from cost sharing. But for all other services, states are going to have to charge at least some cost sharing for services furnished to a person who's enrolled through the expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And it could be, 50 cents, it could be $10 for service, it could vary by service, it could be as high as $35. It does not have to be $35. But can be as high as $35 except for prescription drugs. So prescription drugs, you have to charge a copay, which most states already do for expansion adults, but some states do not. There's lower limits. They're basically the current nominal limits, but states have to charge cost sharing. And then as part of that, they also give providers, or they have the ability to allow providers to deny service if the copay isn't paid at the time the patient's trying to obtain care. And that's a big change from cost sharing rules, where right now providers can't deny services for failure to pay the copay. And this takes effect October 1st, 2028.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, my mic wasn't working before, but thank you.
All good. Thanks, Rebecca. And, Edwin, we're going to move to our next speaker because we have Ellen with us, but thank you for joining us today. I know we'll be inviting you back. There's so much more to talk about, and appreciate your thoughtful overview and time and willingness to answer some questions today. So more to come, and thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, it's our pleasure. And we're going to turn to Ellen now, Ellen Riddleberger with McAllister and Quinn. We met Ellen actually through some of her work with some of our members. And she was kind enough to offer to come and talk a little bit about the landscape, how the shifting landscape in grants is starting to shape up. So please, Ellen.
Thanks so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to join you here today. I've spent my entire career first on Capitol Hill working for a member of the Appropriations Committee, and now at McAllister and Quinn working with nonprofit clients focused on federal funding, whether it's helping our organizations that we work with win federal grants or creating new federal grant programs. So as you said before, I could talk about this for hours and hours, but I will try to keep it brief. And then I'm using a PowerPoint deck today. So for any folks that want it, LSA folks and Sarah have it and can send it out, and it has some hyperlinks for more information on different topics as well. So just a little bit about McAllister and Quinn. We are a grants and government relations firm. We've been around for about 20 years. And over those 20 years, we've helped our clients secure more than $16 billion in grant funding for the organizations that we represent. I lead the firm's nonprofit and public agencies practice, the best practice, I think. And we represent local nonprofits all the way up to large national nonprofits, including some organizations that are members of LSA, which are wonderful to work with. And we provide them with various services depending on their need, from identifying and pursuing grant funding to grantsmanship training to strategic government relations services. So today, just to level set, this is what we're going to focus on. I want to spend a little bit of time on the budget and appropriations process so that we understand where we are in the process and what that means for nonprofits and what we're expecting throughout the remainder of the year. Then I want to turn to the outlook for federal grant programs, what we've seen so far under the Trump administration and what we're expecting down the pike, and then turn to the importance of diversifying funding streams and perhaps give you some information on different avenues to do that. So federal budget and appropriations processes. When we're talking about grants and federal funding for nonprofits, it's important to understand the federal budget and appropriations cycle. Both what's happened so far since the new administration came in and where we are now and where it's going. So it is a process. Typically, the process starts, as some of you probably know, with the president's budget. Normally, that typically is submitted to Congress in February. However, with the new administration, it often comes out a bit later to give the administration time to put together their priorities since they're coming in new. This year, it was significantly later than normal, and we got this so-called skinny budget on May 2nd, and then further budget details for the president's budget on May 30th, although it really wasn't a full-scale administration's budget as we usually see. When it came out, it included some really, really dramatic cuts, particularly to the agencies that fund social services. Overall, the president's budget included a proposed cut of $163 billion just to non-defense discretionary spending. So that's not including entitlements, that's just the discretionary spending that's subject to the annual appropriations process, and that's excluding defense spending, which got a slight increase. For some of the agencies that we're concerned about, HHS in particular, would be cut under the president's budget by $32 billion, and other agencies, including HUD, Department of Education, various other smaller agencies were proposed for huge cuts or even elimination. So what's important to remember about the president's budget, because this all sounds terrible and doom and gloom, is that it does not have the force of law. It is simply a reflection of the administration's priorities, and it is a recommendation to Congress. And in fact, most budgets released by administrations do not match up with the end of the process and what's appropriated, because the appropriations bills are really where the rubber meets the road, and that's what has the force of law. So it's very typical to see a president's budget, like in the first Trump administration, many of his budgets had funding well below what was appropriated in the end. And during President Biden's term, we saw a lot of programs have significantly less funding than was recommended by the president's budget. So the appropriations process tends to operate on a baseline of what was funded the previous year. So that's kind of what's important to remember about the president's budget. I'm going to skip over the congressional budget resolution and the budget reconciliation process. I know you've heard a lot about the congressional budget reconciliation process and the so-called one big beautiful bill. And I want to focus in on the appropriations process, which covers annual discretionary spending, meaning that Congress has discretion over it every year. And this is the funding that funds grant programs, that keeps the lights on at government agencies, that funds the day-to-day functions of the government. So the federal appropriations process, where we are right now, is sort of here in the middle of this chart. We're in markup season, right? So the House and the Senate appropriations committees and their 12 subcommittees of the House and Senate appropriations committees are in the midst of marking up, so making changes, drafting, making amendments to the 12 annual appropriations bills. What's important takeaway for us from this process right now is that originally, when the appropriations process kicked off this year, House leadership, Speaker Mike Johnson, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole, had said that they were going to mark up the 12 House appropriations bills very close to the levels in the president's budget. This has not been the case. So the bills that have been released so far have been much closer to the current fiscal year, FY25, level than the president's budget. So this is a bit of good news. I mean, they're still lower than FY25 funding, with the exception of defense and Homeland, which has some automatic appropriations in it, but they are significantly less bad or have significantly less cuts than the president's budget had set up. The Senate had always said that they were not going to mark up to the president's budget levels, and they seem to be marking up closer to the current year's funding levels. So we'll go through the appropriations process this year. The appropriations process is supposed to be over by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. However, Congress hardly ever, not in recent memory, have they met that deadline. What they typically do is kick the can down the road by passing a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government funded at the current year's level while they take some more time to get passage of the appropriations bills. And typically in recent years, they've been passed in large omnibus packages. This past year, we had a year-long continuing resolution in March, so it really was only covering half the year. But they never finalized the fiscal year 2025 appropriations and instead funded the government at the FY24 levels. We may have a year-long continuing resolution this year. We may have a short-term government shutdown and then a continuing resolution. We may have a large omnibus that includes all 12 bills, or we may have a series of smaller minibuses that contain the bills. We'll have to see. I think Congress will probably pass at least some of these into law, but for some of the more contentious bills, we may end up seeing a continuing resolution for those. We'll have to wait and see. But what does this all mean for nonprofits and for federal grant funding for nonprofits? So next slide. Actually, the next one after that. So federal grants in the new administration. So it's been a very, very tumultuous time, to say the least. The first 6 months of the Trump administration have been really, really chaotic. A lot of things have been changing. We saw DOJ come in at the beginning of the administration and recommend cuts to entire agencies, eliminations of programs, canceling existing obligated grant funds. There have been lots of lawsuits challenging these. A lot of these decisions have already been overturned. A lot of them are working their way through the legal process as we speak. A great resource on this, by the way, which I've included a hyperlink at the bottom of this slide, is Just Security website, which has a litigation tracker that is tracking all the various lawsuits, both on some of the grants that have been revoked, as well as on some of the agency eliminations and personnel eliminations, and also on some of the executive orders that have come down. Several of the nonprofits that we work with have had their grants canceled midstream. So if that's happened to you, which it may have, it's happened to one of our clients that's an LSA member. What we've been encouraging the folks that we work with to do is to appeal if it's not too late to file that appeal, unless you're joining litigation, which sometimes that prohibits appealing, or they don't want you to appeal to be part of the class. But appeal if you can, and then also let your elected officials know, let your senators know, let your House of Representatives members know that this funding has been canceled, regardless of their political ideology and whether it lines up with yours. They need to understand and know that services to their constituents are being revoked or interrupted because this grant has been canceled. If those members of Congress, senators, even your governor, might have a good relationship with folks in the administration or at the cabinet level or at the agency level, have them weigh in on your behalf. We have seen appeals work. We've seen grant funding decisions overturned, not just through litigation, but through the appeals process. There's some links here on from resources from our website and the National Council of Nonprofits that are really great on this topic. So changes to the federal grants landscape. So there have been quite a few. What we've seen for the grants that have been released so far, and grants are coming out, they were very slow, but they are coming out. We've seen some changes to the grant solicitations, including inclusion of language restricting DEI, gender identity terms, climate change, anything on green energy, language prohibiting services to undocumented immigrants. And a lot of the times, these changes actually contradict current law. So it is kind of confusing and difficult to navigate. What we've been doing with the folks we represent is recommending that they write to the solicitation. And in most cases, it's still possible to do that without compromising your mission. So, there are different terms you can use instead of talking about a specific racial or ethnic group that you've been focusing on. Talk about low-income individuals, talk about first-generation students if it's an education program. For a lot of our conservation clients, we've been saying ocean acidification, extreme weather events, other terms for climate change. And, really emphasizing that your programs are open to everybody that is eligible under this grant solicitation language. You're not excluding anyone. That's pretty important to emphasize. Next slide. So other changes to the grants landscape. So as I mentioned, grants are coming out. However, they were not coming out as expected or as forecast. So for the first few months of the Trump administration, we saw very, very few grants coming out at all. That was for two reasons. One, the fiscal year 2025 appropriations funding was delayed until mid-March. Right? So we talked about that fiscal year deadline being September 30th. March is almost halfway through the year. So the agencies didn't know exactly how much money they were going to have to fund these grant programs. Hence, they were a little bit behind, even if we hadn't had a new administration. Secondly, when a new administration comes in, they always want to take a beat to put their stamp on grant solicitations. Obviously, this administration took more than a beat and eliminated some programs, had some significant changes to other programs, but part of that delay is a bit normal. This was a bit longer. So in addition to grants coming out much later than they were forecast, we've also seen really compressed timelines. Short as 2 weeks when normally you have 6 weeks or sometimes even longer to from when the grant comes out to when it's due. So this is a really, really compressed timeline, and it's really hard to write a competitive grant application, particularly if it's a larger federal grant, in a 2-week timeline, which has proved really, really challenging. For example, just this week, a couple days ago, the Administration for Children and Families released a highly anticipated tranche of 3 grants called the Healthy Marriages and Relationship Grants. They have some new acronyms now, but it's 3 different grants that fall under that rubric. They only come out every 5 years, and they're really large. They're up to $6 million a piece. Actually, we're still on the prior slide. Those came out with a deadline of July 29th. Thankfully, we've been anticipating this, and for the organizations we're working with, we had worked ahead based on the prior solicitation and have really strong working drafts that just need to be tweaked a little bit, but again, really challenging under this compressed timeline. So for the fiscal year 2026 cycle, we expect, because the administration won't be new anymore and they have, adjusted solicitations to more conform with their priorities, we expect the grant cycle to be much more normalized next year. Next slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these programs, but this is just a snapshot. And again, you can have the slides so you can refer back to this of grants that have come out. Some of them have already been due. Some of them are due later this month or later this year. But you can see Department of Justice has been releasing grants. In particular, the Office of Violence Against Women has released several grants. Next slide. The Department of Health and Human Services. I mentioned the Administration for Children and Families. You can see the last 3 bullet points under ACF. are those healthy relationship grants that are due later this month, but they also release some of their other standard grants. The top three are typically on an annual cycle. SAMHSA slide. And then HUD and the EDA have released several grants as well. One that I wanted to draw your attention to, and there's a hyperlink to more information on this at the bottom, is the FY25 Disaster Supplemental out of the Economic Development Administration. This is a grant that nonprofits are eligible in addition to, units of local government, counties, specifically for areas where there was a disaster designation in calendar year 2023 or calendar year 2024. So it has a rolling deadline, which is great. So it's not that compressed timeline. For more information on that grant, you can look at the hyperlink that's included there, but it's quite a bit of money. Next slide. So the Department of Agriculture released a tranche of grants that have traditionally been great sources of funding for nonprofits that were due earlier in the year, but those are typically on an annual cycle. So we expect to see them next year as well. And then, okay, great. So that's it for Department of Agriculture. Next slide. So given that funding through federal grants is a bit more precarious and chaotic, to say the least, than it has been, and a bit less reliable, what other sources of funding can your nonprofit look to help diversify funding during this precarious time, but also in the future to help sustain the great work that you are doing? So, earmarks. I'm not sure how many of you have taken advantage of this process. Earmarks are called different things depending on who you're talking to. In the House, they're known as congressionally directed spending. Sorry, that's in the Senate. In the House, they're known as community projects funding. I just call them earmarks because that's what I've always called them going back, almost 30 years ago when I was working for Congress. But this is a great way for members of Congress and senators to bring funding directly home to their states and districts. So practically speaking, an earmark is a grant or a set aside that's written directly for you. So instead of having to fit into the very defined box of a grant solicitation, with earmark funding, it's a lot more flexible. And as long as you're spending it on authorized uses under statute for that account, which are, they're much broader than an individual grant solicitation, you can kind of create whatever program it is around the funding that you want to do on the ground for the folks you serve. So they've been around for a long time, and they're very politically beneficial to members of Congress, particularly when they're in a tough reelect. And we're coming up on a cycle that's going to be pretty tumultuous with with several districts in play. So members like to use these to help bolster their reelection efforts and show that they're bringing home resources to help their constituencies. They did take a hiatus in fiscal year 2011, but they returned in FY22. But they do have really rigorous transparency requirements, and there is a process. With earmarks, it's really important to understand the process, because if you don't follow the deadlines, if you're not in line with the eligibility requirements for the specific accounts, which are different in the House and the Senate, there are some accounts that are available in the Senate that are not available in the House, particularly for nonprofits, you're going to be out of luck. So you need to follow the process. I'm happy to talk through any ideas or any of this with any folks if they want to offline. But a good way to find out about this is to contact your individual members of Congress and senators and ask about the process. They are required to post all of their earmark requests on their website. So that's also a great resource to see, what has your senator funded in the past? What has your member of Congress funded in the past? Are they even funding nonprofits? Some of them will only fund governmental entities, so cities and counties. But we've had a lot of success with earmarks for the folks that we represent. In fact, this cycle, so we're, in cycle for fiscal year 2026, we are pending on Senator Slotkin's list for about 2.5 million for an LSA entity in Michigan to build a new community service center hub for the folks that they serve. So fingers crossed on that one. We won't know until the final process goes through.
Edwin,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. There was a question when you were going through HUD on the continuum of care funding, and the question was around if you know when the notice of funding opportunity might be released.
I do
Not to
not.
put you on the spot.
I
Okay.
know, I do not, but I'm happy to check on what our latest intel on that is. It's possible that one of my colleagues has been in touch with the program officer over there. So if whoever it is wants to follow up with a direct email to me, I can look into it. Some of the program officers are much more forthcoming than others. So
Yeah, we had inquired previously on that program, and we could follow up. I thought you might know.
I don't know off the top of my head, no. But someone here may know, so I'll check on it. So the slide after earmarks, so we should be state and county grants. So if you haven't already explored state and county, even city funding, this is a great, more stable source of funding right now than some of the federal grant programs that may or may not be happening. Obviously, they're subject to state budget conditions, which may be getting worse in the coming years because of some of these Medicaid and other cuts. But we have seen state grants, particularly in larger states like California, Texas, New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that are sometimes really large and often larger than federal grants. One of the ones that we highlighted here, in case you're in California, that just came out this week, is the California Community Reinvestment Grant. It's a great grant program. Nonprofits across the board are eligible. It's anywhere from 600,000 to up to 3 million with a 3-year spend period, which is great. There's a link to more information on this grant included here as well. Next slide. So foundation grants. If you haven't already considered foundations, foundations are another great source of funding that continues to be pretty stable. 2024 was a banner year for foundations. Almost 110 billion given out in foundation grants, representing 1,000 foundation grants. Represents about 19% of total giving, so it's a big share of it. A lot of the organizations that we work with have done a really good job of kind of drawing a circle around their local foundations or local community foundations, who's funding in their community. What we try to do is kind of broaden that circle out to state, regional, even national foundations that may be really well aligned with their mission to take advantage of that. And some foundations are stepping up to specifically fill the breach where there have been cuts. So California Wellness Foundation, for example, there's a link included here, has committed a record 67 million, which was an additional 14 million over what they had already pledged to specifically support health, racial justice, wellness programs, particularly impacting communities of color and immigrant communities to kind of fill the breach there. Next slide. I know we're getting close to the end here, so I'll try to keep it quick. So another great source of funding, if your organization is doing anything related to substance use disorder prevention or treatment, is the opioid settlement. This includes about $56 billion and counting that will be dispersed over 18 years. It's already being dispersed, and will about 18 years in total. Every state has a different process for this. We have a blog on this on our website, so you can click on that for more information. But A lot of the organizations we work with have had success with this. Sometimes it flows directly from the state, sometimes it's from the county. Every state does it differently, but encourage you to look into that because it's a lot of money. Next slide is just a couple examples of recent successes that we've had at the the state, local, and foundation level, but I wanted to allow time for questions. So it's the last slide.
Ellen, thank you so much. We are out of time, but I know Valerie put your email in the chat. So if folks do have questions for Ellen, please reach out. And we appreciate so much your time to cover as best you could in a short amount of time, all these great opportunities. Well, again, I don't think great's the right word, but timely opportunities. And in some cases, very good. So
They're still out
appreciate it.
there.
Yes, and it is a constantly shifting landscape. You can look for LSA Together in your inboxes soon, and we've tried to provide updates there on Medicaid, and we'll include some of this great information Ellen shared as well, in addition to sharing this recording with all of you. So thank you so much. More to come, as always. Appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.